Let me tell you a story. Most people today seem to view homelessness in America as a problem without a practical solution. There are just too many people, too much need, and we can't solve that problem by throwing money at it. Nobody has enough money for that. It wasn't much different in 1968. A man named Clarence Jordan had some land in Georgia, and a couple named Fuller had some money. The money they had was chicken feed, though, compared to the scope of what it would take to even make a dent in the problem across America. They started building what they called partnership houses. Some other people got involved, and the project grew. Well, the organization that Mr. Jordan and the Fullers founded, last year it built its 600,000th house. More than 3 million people today live in houses built by Habitat for Humanity all over the world, and that number keeps rising. This very congregation has helped build more than a dozen of these houses, and another is in progress. They started that organization with some land and some money, but lots of people have land and money. Lots of people don't start something that makes that kind of a difference in the lives of millions of people all over the world. The Fullers' assets were not enough for the task, but something was enough. In 1999, a journalist named Sarah Miles realized that in parts of the city where she lived, it was far easier to get drugs than it was to get something healthy, like, say, an actual tomato. No wonder poor people were unhealthy. Now, Sarah had basically no money and a home congregation that was reluctant to get personally involved. She herself was a recent convert to Christianity. But she started talking to people and making contacts. She talked the city food bank into giving her some produce to give away to the poor. What she started has taken on a life of its own, and now they give away food every Friday to over 1,000 families just at that original site. The program has been copied all over San Francisco and other cities as well, giving away literally tons of food and feeding thousands of hungry people every week. Sarah's assets were different from the Fullers. She didn't have money or land. She had a congregation that she could talk into helping, and she had persistence, and that was about it. Her assets were not enough for the task, but something was enough. In our gospel reading today, Jesus' disciples have a problem. They have 5,000 people who have come all the way around the Sea of Galilee to hear Jesus. That means that Jesus and his disciples are kind of responsible for these people. And it's dinner time. Just to confirm that this is their problem, Jesus asks them, "Where are we going to buy enough food for all these people to eat?" The disciples respond like the good business people they were before Jesus called them. They immediately define the problem, get some numbers, and try to figure out the scope of a solution. Philip estimates that it would take 6 months' wages to buy enough food for all these people. Andrew reviews their assets and comes up with 5 loaves of cheap barley bread and 2 fish. He concludes that their assets are not enough for the task. In Matthew's telling of this same story, the disciples look at Jesus and say basically, "We got nothing." The disciples, though, seem to have forgotten that God created the universe out of nothing. God made Israel into a people who once were no people. When the Israelites complained in the desert that they didn't have any food to eat, they received their daily bread. God made manna out of nothing. God makes something out of nothing all the time. The pastor and writer Nadia Bolz-Weber says that perhaps God looks upon that which we dismiss as nothing, insignificant, and worthless, and says, "Ha! Now that I can do something with." Jesus has the crowd sit down and tells the disciples to start serving the food that they have. Somehow, there is so much food that everyone eats until they're full, and the disciples gather up 12 baskets of leftovers. They finish with more food than they started with. Their assets were not enough for the task, but something was enough. Clarence Jordan and the Fullers, who founded Habitat for Humanity, started an almost unimaginable task: to build houses for all the people who needed them. But they had some land to start, they had some money, and like Bartimaeus last week, they were following Christ along the way. It's a long-term effort, but Habitat is making a dent in homelessness today. Sarah had no money and only reluctant agreement from her congregation to serve as a food giveaway site. She was trying to feed thousands of people, but she was following Christ along the way. And thousands of people have eaten thanks to her faithful following. The disciples had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and 5,000 people to feed. But they were following Christ along the way. And not only did 5,000 people eat that day, but there was food to spare, to give away to the poor. Overbrook, too, is following Christ along the way. And we, too, have limited assets. We have a large and beautiful building in a good location. We have some land, both here and at the retreat center. We have loving people with a great variety of skills. And we have some money. You know, that's how we usually look at it. Or more likely in America today, if someone talks about assets, we talk about land, buildings, and cash on hand. Let me suggest a different way of looking at it. In this place called Columbus, God has a church. In that church, God has many loving people with different skills. And God has a large, beautiful building. God has some land. And God has money. God made it all and told us to be stewards of it and to use it for God's purposes in the world. When we follow Christ along the way and we use those assets to accomplish God's purposes, that is God acting in the world. We get the privilege of being part of it. God does things with what we have, and God does things with the nothing that we have. If we look at things that way, let's see what our stories sound like now. Jesus saw 5,000 people in need of food for their bodies and their souls. He had a bunch of disciples willing to serve. He had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. With those assets, Jesus fed 5,000 people, and there were enough leftovers to fill 12 baskets. The disciples got the privilege of helping Jesus perform a miracle and serve all those people. Jesus provided enough. God saw thousands of people in need of the healthy foods of creation. God had a congregation with a building on the edge of a barrio and some people who could be convinced. And God had a pushy reporter who knew a little bit about food. With those assets, God started feeding thousands of people every week. God continues to feed them every week. Sarah and her congregation get the privilege of being some of God's hands, providing that food to the people who need it. God provides enough. God saw millions of people without homes, without a stable, safe place, something that many of us take for granted. God had a farmer with some land, and God had a recently retired couple with some money they'd made in business. With those assets, God started a movement that has sheltered millions of people. Thousands of people, some of us here in this room, have gotten the privilege of helping God do it. God provides enough. So, having heard these stories, these pieces of God's story, let's look at each of our individual lives, each of our individual assets. This isn't something I can do for you, but you don't need me to do it for you. We serve an amazing God who has given you skills and abilities and resources. Don't try to tell me you have nothing. We serve a God who does amazing things with nothing. Where is God working in the world that your voice, your hands, your resources could help? Where could you accept the holy privilege of doing God's work in the world? My friends, I tell you, I am the church. You are the church. Dream big. Amen.